are so many myths about being an entrepreneur, about what it's like to found a company, what will happen next, what every day will look like. And most of them are really far from the actual realities of it all. So our next speaker, Tom Nixon, has spent over 20 years on the roller coaster ride of being a founder. He's been involved in startups, pivoting, turnarounds, and even closures. Now, Tom specializes in helping founders to step into the truly creative part of their role, less chief executive and more chief artist. And today he's going to share the things that nobody tells you about being a founder. So, Mr. Nixon, take it away, sir.
Thank you so much, David. And it was lovely to arrive when there was music and dancing. That was so cool. I wish I had more time to get involved. I was wondering whether to get up on my feet and then it all finished. But yeah, thanks so much for welcoming me here. I'm just curious, before I begin, how many of you guys here are founders of some kind of initiative? Just giving you like a big wave so we can get a bit of a sense. Oh, quite a few of you. It's probably half. And then of the rest, there's some of you guys advisors to founders, like coaches, consultants, that kind of thing. I can see some people nodding and waving. Cool. Okay, well, hopefully this will be relevant to all of you. And actually, even those of you who aren't founders might find something useful here for the times when you step into an initiative that somebody else has started. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I will talk you through the thing that nobody tells you about being a founder. Cool. So hopefully this is loading and everyone can see it. I assume someone will tell me if not. Okay, here we go. Wonderful. So really what I'm going to introduce to you today is a new way of seeing, like a new pair of glasses that you can put on to see the world differently. And this particular lens or way of seeing is really about how ideas can be made a reality in the world. And it really comes from decades of experience with hundreds, possibly thousands of people about how they do this, how they make ideas a reality, which was led by my great friend and teacher, Peter Koenig. And as I explain this to you, I'm really going to advocate quite passionately for this particular way of looking at things. But really, I just want you to add this lens to your repertoire, because an old friend of mine said, you know, the old way was to try and win by believing that your model is right and everybody else is wrong. But the new way of winning is by being the person who has the most ways of seeing, the most mental models. So I hope you'll get something useful from this. So let me tell you, let's dive straight in. Here's the thing that nobody tells you about being a founder. And it starts with this, the role of source. So in every human initiative to realize an idea, you will find exactly one person in this particular role, which we call the role of source. And it's a role that emerges naturally. It's not appointed through an election or a job interview process, nor is it a role that's shared amongst more than one person, even when we perceive that there are multiple co-founders. And this role is less kind of commander-in-chief, but it's more like the chief listener, the person who's listening to the vision and the sense of where the initiative is going next. And I know that some of you here are likely to have more of an egalitarian mindset about systems where everybody is equal. And so this might be slightly uncomfortable to think about, and that's okay if that's the case. So I would just encourage you just to let the idea settle, even if it does feel a bit uncomfortable. Moving on, when we start to think about people working together to realize a vision in the world, we usually start thinking about organizations. We start thinking about structure and processes and the legal entity and the shares that's underneath it all, and maybe even the formal organization of the informal links of influence and trust. And that, of course, can be powerful. But it's not always adequate, because what we tend to do is we think of organizations as things in their own right. We think that Google is a thing or Greenpeace is a thing. And what I want to encourage you to do is to think about this slightly differently, that instead of organizations being a thing, we just think about organizing as a process, as a thing that we do. And as we make this shift, we see that underneath all of our efforts to organize, underneath all of the organizational stuff, we can see something else under there. We can see all of the work and the organizing that's happening as activity that's happening in a space that we can call a creative field. And the way I think of a creative field is it's partly like the ground we stand on or the planet that we inhabit as we work together to realize the idea. And it's partly like a gravitational field. It's the thing that attracts in the people and the resources that are needed to make the idea happen. It's the thing that holds it all together. And you might recall times in your life where you felt just really drawn to an initiative that's happening. And that's the creative field that's pulling you in. Now, the individual in the role of source has a very particular, very individual and intimate connection to her creative field and to the vision and the process of realizing it that's unlike anybody else. We also see that the source person is vital for the feeling of lifefulness and vitality in the field, and it's really closely linked to her. If the source is kind of up and their energy is good, you'll see that reflected in the field, and if it's down, then you will feel that as well. And that will continue until she passes the role of source on to a successor through a rite of passage process. And when we look at things in this way, what we start to see is that what might on the surface appear like organizational problems or tensions or cultural issues and behavioral issues that are going on inside a particular initiative actually have their root in the creative field and ultimately with the person in the role of source. And so noticing if that person in the role of source is you is really important so that you can really step into that role and exercise your responsibilities really well to create the conditions for the idea, whatever that may be, to be realized. So I've got a couple more concepts for you, then I'm going to pause and take questions because I know this is a little bit concepty, but we're going to have a chance in a sec to bounce this off you. So I just want to give you a sense of how creative initiatives are born. So if you imagine that this field of stars we're looking at here is like a universe of all of the potential ideas that anybody could create, all the ideas for projects and companies and non-profits and movements we could possibly think of, we can recognize that ideas themselves have no clear beginning. They're built on many inspirations and influences that come before. But then once in a while, there's a moment where somebody actually takes a first risk to invest themselves in actually realizing an idea. So I mean, not just talking about the idea or thinking about it, but taking a real step to start bringing an idea into reality, which could be inviting in other people or asking for a commitment to work together. And when that happens, that's the moment that the role of source is established and that the creative field is established around the source. And the way I visualize this is I think of it being a bit like a circle has now been carved out of the universe of potential. And now we have an edge. There are now some things that are in that this initiative is doing, and there are some things that are outside of it. And then finally, whilst the person in the role of source is holding the outer edge of the initiative, other people will naturally take responsibility for parts of the whole. And we call them specific sources because they're holding a specific part of something larger. And the way to think about this is that within these more specific domains, that individual has exactly the same responsibilities as the source. They have a natural sense of authorship over that part of the whole. And if you want to, a process that I use quite often is to visualize initiatives in this pattern of nested circles. Some colleagues and I developed a software tool called Map.to, which you can check out if you're interested, which helps you to visually map and share a creative field. So those are a few concepts just to get us started. So to quickly recap, there's the role of source. There's this very unique special role that the original founder who takes the first risk to invest themselves in an idea naturally adopts. And then we see the phenomenon of a creative field, like the ground we stand on and the attractive field that draws people and resources towards an initiative that exists underneath all of our efforts to organize. And then finally, we have this pattern of nested circles that shows how an initiative breaks down into ever smaller, more specific things. And at each point, you have somebody in the role of source for that part of the whole. So those are a few concepts to get us started. I've gone through that really quickly. Sometimes I spend like 2 hours doing a workshop like this, but I just wanted to give you a quick whistle-stop tour. So let me pause there because I'm curious what's coming up for you. Is this making sense? Have you got questions? Thinking about yourself, are you the source for something? When you look at your work through this different lens, do you notice that you're the source? What does it bring up for you? Any stories or current situations or any other questions? So let me stop sharing my screen and seeing what's going on for you. See if I've kept you with me or if I've lost you. But yeah, who has a question? You can either raise your hand in Zoom or just unmute yourself and we'll try and self-organize.
Are we only talking about source now or all three of the frames you introduced?
Anything at all from what I've just introduced.
I really like that creative frame in the sense of attracting resources, because I wrestle with the concept of enterprise and bureaucracy and try to think of what we're doing as something other than just these resource consuming machines, but some sort of meaningful creating machines as well. So that's what that frame makes me think about.
Yeah, thank you, Claudio. I would really share that with you. And so a lot of the time when I'm working with founders, often their mindset is thinking about, okay, well, we're building a company or we're building an organization. And instead, what I find really powerful is to see the work as just a creative initiative. So there's a process in play to make some kind of idea happen in the world. So when you're in this role of source, if you're a founder, I encourage people to first of all see themselves as an artist even more than a leader or a CEO or anything formal like that. It's like it's your job to bring something new into the world or to change something. So it's a very different mindset to what we typically do in business or in organization development. So yeah, thank you for that.
Tom, my question feeds into that a little bit. You mentioned that when semi-organizational issues arise, they can actually be coming from the creative field. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and how one identifies whether it really is an organizational or whether it's a fundamental issue in the creative field? Thank you.
Yeah. So when we think of organizational or cultural tensions, so there might be behaviors that are really destructive or getting in the way of progress towards the vision, or there might be tensions like, creeping bureaucracy. Underneath all of that cultural and organizational stuff, when you start to look at it through the lens of, okay, well, who's the source around here? That's the first thing I always do when I enter a new initiative is go, who's the person that this thing really came from? And what you start to see is that the tensions you see are mirroring that person. So in any organization where, and you've probably experienced some, and also the famous examples that make the news of organizations with problematic cultures. You might have remembered Brewdog, for example, has been in the press, many times recently for this kind of like pumped up macho sort of, quite toxic culture there which many people became whistleblowers towards. So you can look at that and go, oh, there's a problem at Brewdog, and Brewdog is a thing and it has a culture. Or we can say, well, who's the source there? Which of the founders is it? Is it James Watt, perhaps, who seems to be the most visible person there? And then you start to get a different perspective on it, and you can see how those issues are actually a reflection of that person. So then you don't just try and fix Brewdog, you just try and work on the source, and then that ripples outwards. I could say more about it, but let me pause there for the sake of time.
I have a question on that. So so much of what we see in the corporate coaching and these kind of worlds are kind of like retro fitting these systems that maybe like it's I think it's what Naomi Klein calls the changeless change. Like it's literally patching up, accepting that what got that person to that position, and the ramifications of of that way of being are fine now, and we'll just patch them up, and it's the job of everyone else or other people to come in and rescue and fix. So just in that example of the brew, I think we're getting slightly off topic because it's not focused on creativity and framing a business with creativity. But you mentioned handing over the role of source. When does that happen, and what does that look like?
Yeah, exactly.
Because
yes.
Instead of trying to fix the person or impart onto them ways of being or thinking and keeping them in their position of source, how is it what does that look like?
Yeah, so let me focus on the succession part of your question for the sake of time. And this is actually one of the most fascinating parts of this work. So I'm glad that you raised it. And the way to think about this is it's kind of like a dance between an outgoing source and then a person who's going to become their successor. And sometimes this dance can take many years to unfold. And it only happens when the outgoing source feels really ready to genuinely let go. And the way I think of it is it's like they're holding this precious gift, and they have to feel ready to let this thing go, like they're done and ready to move on. And somebody else has to be ready to take it. And that's the dance. It's like, am I ready to let this go? Are you ready to take it? And although that process can sometimes take years, certainly for an endeavor that's been around for a long time, but when it does happen, it passes in an instant. And it's really quite fascinating because we've gathered stories of this happening over the years. I've even heard, one I worked on this year, he said it actually ended up happening on a Zoom call. They've been planning the exit of a founder, and then this guy was going to take over. And so what we looked at is not just the formal process of taking over the managing director role, but actually this deeper process in the creative field of the role of source being passed over. And the two of them danced for a while. And they shared this really, really special moment on a Zoom call, and both of them felt changed by it. And the incoming source said, I felt differently. I felt like I'd finally taken this thing, and now it was mine. So that's a couple of principles. There's a bunch more. And thank you, Lana, for highlighting my book. If anyone wants to check it out, I'll give you the link in a bit. I've just even got a copy there. That's kind. But those are, a few things just to get you started. And then Sarah, I can see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating. The first thing that I have to say got me confused. I had this image of working with source, or the role of source, as source being like very spiritual.
Yeah.
And so took me a while to shift and say, oh, it's still spiritual probably, but a different kind of source and a different reference to source.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, because some people do refer to source. If you're into theory U, for example, sometimes in that context they talk about source being like the field of untapped potential, like that slide full of stars that I showed you. Actually, the way that I use source here from Peter Koenig's work actually predates that. And it's a shame that the guys who did the theory U process weren't aware of it, I don't think, at the time, which I think is part of the confusion that arises there. But I think in some ways there is a spiritual angle to this. In some ways it's very practical, because it's based on observation. It's like what seems to be going on when an idea is flowing and coming into the world. And usually when that happens, you can spot, oh, there's someone who's the source and they seem to be holding it really well. And when that's not happening, then you usually see things that are getting stuck. But then
my follow-up question, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing, then I'll come to a follow-up question. And but the question is like, when a source takes the initiative and establishes a field, where does that come from for them? And that's where it does become quite spiritual. And people ask me this sometimes, and I say, you need to consult your own sort of spiritual beliefs and your own spiritual gurus, because that's not what I do. But sometimes people say, that's what comes from Mother Earth, or from God, or from the universe, or from the field of limitless potential, however you express it spiritually. So ultimately, what is it that injects us with the inspiration and the energy to start something new? I really have no idea, and it's a lovely question to ponder, and there's no ultimate answer to that. Let me take your follow-up question, and then I'll move
kind of along the same lines as what Killian said. It seems very relevant for new businesses emerging going forward, and I think that's kind of built into the new business paradigm. The question is, how do we fix people who are already in power and who are holding on to it very tightly and just don't want to give over the role of source.
So there's two answers to that. So the answer in terms of intervening in that initiative, launching an inquiry into where that initiative came from can be really powerful. I mean, a quick example of this is the story of when Paul Polman took over as the CEO of Unilever. So obviously a huge multinational organizations. We can pick holes in them in many ways, but he was also quite pioneering, in my view, in other ways there. But when he started there, he did a process of what he called walking in William Lever's shoes. So without knowing about source, he kind of quite instinctively went and found the person who was the source, who obviously long dead, and he kind of stalked his ghost and found out what was William Lever all about. And it might be that something along the lines of a succession happened to Paul Polman, and that was why he was able to do perhaps more than many corporate CEOs were able to do. So using that as one particular line of investigation is part of it. But the other really important thing that you've touched on here is that it's not just about us finding who's the source of some particular initiative and us just following that. All of us can be sources, so we can all be on our own creative journey in life. And if we see something going on that we think is really harmful or wrong, then it's our job to rebel or to leave or to start something new and make that thing obsolete, or even in some cases to fight it. So that's really key as well, because sometimes, and it's hard in a short introduction like this to necessarily get this across, but we don't want to just be subservient to the person in the role of source in a particular endeavor. We want to start with ourselves as sources and think, how am I manifesting whatever it feels like is mine to do in the world? Have I started an initiative that attracts others in, or have I decided to take my own energy and step into someone else's field? And so on that level, we are all equal. So from that perspective, it's very different to these very top-down hierarchical structures that can be quite stifling, bureaucratic, and toxic in all kinds of ways, that we're all equal as sources, but we just consciously either invite in or step into creative fields. I hope that sort of explains some of it.
Love that. Yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering if it might help, just because you're already running out of time because it's such a short session. Just would you like sort of a few pointers of, if you find yourself in the role of source, like how are you supposed to orient yourself in this role? Yeah, I'm getting 2 thumbs up from Anya, so that's good enough for me. So let me go back a step here. Cool. So here we go. So the source compass, this is like a thinking tool that you can use. Hopefully we'll get these slides shared to you all. So the way I think about this, when you find yourself in the role of source, the main thing you're doing is navigating these 2 tensions that are represented by the vertical and horizontal axis here. So in this sort of top-down, bottom-up tension, on the one hand, it's the source's job to guard the edge of an initiative, so it doesn't get completely watered down to the lowest common denominator or pulled apart in 1,000 different directions. So to really hold that edge. But then at the same time, they have to act in a very bottom-up way. And that means letting go of responsibility for specific parts of it to other people so that they can fully stand in their power and natural authorship over their part of the whole. And then they have to ride this tension between clarity and doubt. The one very reassuring thing I can tell you is that when you find yourself in the role of source, the chronic state you'll be in most of the time is one of doubt, of just being unsure and unclear about what is the edge, like what is in and what's out, and what is the next step for the initiative as a whole. And so sitting with that, that sense of not knowing is really critical. But then also at the same time accepting that it's only really the source who can get clear and who can then move from not knowing into the process of authoring the story, of bringing the thing into the world or changing the thing that needs to be changed. So sort of seeing where you are in the compass can be quite useful. And then just to add to that a little bit further, these 4 black blocks you can see there are some of the behaviors that I see really good sources employing. So listening is about listening to the information and advice that's coming from the world and from your colleagues around you, and also listening inwardly to your own impulses and sense of, why am I doing the thing that I'm doing? And then we have hosting in the bottom left corner here, which is where you can harness the collective intelligence of the group. So it's not about a hero entrepreneur saying, well, because I'm the source, I just know everything and I'm going to be right. It never works like that, but saying, well, I need to listen to everybody. So we're going to need to host some processes for that to happen. And then it's about sharing source with specific sources, which we've talked about. And then it's being able to actually decide and act, because ultimately it's a really important decision-making role to say what's in and what's out and what's the next step as a whole when it becomes clear. And then finally, sort of across the middle where it says integrated identity, this is where we really move into the realm of inner work. So this is the journey of self-development that we all need to go on. We could spend a whole day on this, but just very briefly, a source, you know, when you are a source bringing an idea into the world, there are going to be times when you're going to have to show up as a particular character. You know, you're going to have to adopt or wear some kind of hat to make the thing happen. And sometimes that's going to feel easy for you. And other times you're going to have to show up in a way that feels really uncomfortable. And so there's an inner journey of a source learning how to integrate a wide range of ways of being. So that's what's there. So that was super fast. How are we doing for time? Have we got a little bit longer?
Yes, you do. In fact, you've still got 8 minutes.
Okay, that's amazing. Okay, well in that case, let me stop sharing again and go back to questions. I'll finish bang on 5 past, I promise. Yeah, what's coming up for you guys hearing this? Oh, sorry. Yeah, just unmute yourself, Rick. I can see you've got your hand up.
Well, Tom, I just want to compliment your languaging and your clarity on these concepts, because the way you're explaining this in such a short time is so clear, and your languaging is so powerful. So, you know, from a communication standpoint, I just want to compliment you for these ideas. And you know, it's groundbreaking, it's revolutionary. It does feel like a new way of doing business. So thank you for bringing this forward.
Oh, thanks, Rick. That's really kind of you. Any other questions? Praise, pushback? Usually at least one person will be like, I think this is bullshit. I don't buy it. What have you got, Dave? Are you going to give me a hard time?
No, I'm not. I'm just, you know, I'm a source, but I'm a one-man band. I'm a solo operator, and it's quite weird to kind of think about my role as being that in the kind of my everyday context of work. I mean, what I'm doing right now is what I do every day: sit in my chair and talk over an internet connection. And I was wondering if there's anything you can kind of tease out of it, because I love that compass. I look at that and I think, yeah, that's almost like a self-development track in its own right, let alone in a company context. So what does that look like for someone who really is actually self-employed, as in a solo operator?
Yeah. Well, you still have to do it all. I mean, in some ways it's simpler because you're not delegating parts of the authorship of the vision to other people. You're doing the whole thing. But that also makes it harder as well, because you have to do the very creative work of sensing where the vision is going and what needs to happen next, as well as all of the kind of the doing work of actually making it a reality. And that's fine if what you're doing is relatively contained, and that's awesome. You know, if we've got millions of people all doing their one thing really well, that's great. As an idea scales up, if you want to build a social movement, you know, like I've worked in sort of Extinction Rebellion, for example, to say how can we genuinely put pressure on government to make radical shifts. That requires many people, many thousands of people. And then as the source, you can think, well, which is the bit that I need to really do, and what do I need help with? If we had more time, we could go into the masculine and feminine angle and all this, which is a new angle that I'm starting to get really into, because the way I see this is that at its root, the role of source is a feminine role, because it's a life-giving role. It's like sourcing the life force, which I think is being very feminine. And then some of those behaviors that I outlined about kind of like listening and holding space and hosting and deciding, some of that stuff's quite masculine. And so sometimes what I think about is about this, and I get this from my colleague Fanny Norlin in Sweden, who's a real leading light in feminine leadership. And what she taught me is to think about this archetype of like the witch or the wild woman as being like the heart of creativity. And then the masculine king, which is like the kind of the holding space and clarifying kind of energy. And then we have the warrior energy, which is going out there and building stuff and making shit happen. And then we have the other side of the feminine energy, which is about caregiving and looking after people. I mean, there's another whole angle around all of this around male bodies and female bodies, which I'm super fascinated in. And I'll be happy to get into that with any of you sometime. But yeah, that's another whole big area to explore. Yeah.
Never thought of myself as a wild woman witch before, but I quite like it.
Well, this is the fun thing. It's like, I think we're all of us, no matter what kind of body we have or what kind of gender identity we have, I think we're all capable of tapping into all of those masculine and feminine energies. There's a really interesting question about whether certain bodies are better equipped to do certain parts of that. I'm really not sure, but it's an interesting area to inquire into. But sometimes what I recommend is if I work with someone who clearly identifies as a woman and is very good at embodying that witchy feminine energy, sometimes she needs to find a king to provide some of that other masculine strength. And a lot of the male sources that I work with need to go find themselves a witch, or to stop suppressing the witch who's getting shut down in their field because everyone's actually deep down scared of her. But yeah, there's layers and layers of that stuff we could unpick, and it's still being discovered, really.
Tom, can I just
Alan, yeah, please do
that. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I've heard a lot about your work, and to see it at first hand has been fantastic. And I just wanted to speak before I rush off for a lunch break here in the UK. I'm a bit later than in the Europe time. That to look at this, check out this book, and forgive me, there is a slight promotion here, but Visionary Male Leaders. This is a book that's just come out, and it's all about feminine and masculine energy, and it's approached by 15 different people who've all had a go at looking at the male and female sides of leadership, and bringing up and advocating more of the feminine side, and the bit that really the alpha is exact opposite of the alpha male side of leadership, and what's traditionally been thought of as that aggressive, pushing, kind of ambitious stuff. And that there's going to be a huge benefit in blending the two and talking more about empathy and empathic conscious leadership. So I think blending those two and removing a lot of the stigma that's around them is a really important point. So I'm delighted you've mentioned that. Thank you.
Cool. To be continued, I'm sure. I can see we've only got Anya. Is yours a super quick one? We've got 2 minutes left.
Well, it's just this idea of being the source and tying in this idea of self as instrument, or use of self, and being conscious of that, and how that can be something which you can do to actually really, does your work help people to recognize that they can use themselves as an instrument?
Oh yeah, 100%. It's very personal work to unleash the artist, within yourself. So yes. So I think, we should probably start moving towards a close now. Someone's asked, can we get the slides? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. The final slide here has got my contact details on it. You can buy the book if you feel so inclined. I created a website recently called fieldmapping.org, which gives you, if you want to practice to actually start to map things out using this lens, there's a bit of an introduction there. It's quite a basic website, but it was a starting point. And then Maptio is the software tool I mentioned if you want to do it digitally. So there's some stuff there, but we'll get these slides shared with you all. Cool. 5 past. I'm done. Back to you, David.
If I may, Tom,
Yes.
I have an invitation. Join the community and feel free to share your resources there, and you can continue the conversation. This is what I'm trying to say. The purpose of this conference is to start the conversation. We realize it's impossible to exhaust the topic, because we are still discovering how to do it. So let's continue this conversation.
And if you're like me, you'll be savoring Tom's book. There you go.
Really kind of you. Thank you. I'd love to join the community. And thank you. Thank you all for your openness and your questions. I've really enjoyed this super fast dive into it.
Well, it sounds like you do it every day, Tom, because that was super succinct. And as Rick said, I think you were able to present what is obviously a very nuanced and quite detailed approach in a very easy to understand way. So thank you very much for doing that. Much appreciated.